Beneath 40 feet of Mediterranean waters, divers move through darkness, their lights catching glimpses of something that shouldn't exist here. Towering stone structures rise from the seabed, arranged in deliberate rows, their surfaces still polished after 2,000 years beneath the waves. Massive columns reach upward through the water, over 20 feet tall, their bases buried in sand and sediment. Ancient amphorae lie scattered across what appears to be a carefully laid floor, the kind of construction that speaks of wealth, of power, of a civilization that knew it was building for eternity. This is not a sunken ship. This is a port, an entire harbour complex swallowed by the sea, waiting in silence since the days when Egypt's last pharaoh walked the earth. For 2 decades, a Dominican archaeologist named Kathleen Martinez has been searching for the most famous missing tomb in history. Most of the archaeological establishment dismissed her theories, questioned her credentials, doubted her methods. She wasn't supposed to be here. She was a criminal lawyer, not an Egyptologist. She had no formal training in archaeology. She had no powerful university backing her research. She had only a theory that everyone else said was wrong, and a determination that bordered on obsession. But now, in September of 2024, standing on the deck of a research vessel off the coast of Egypt, Martinez watches as sonar data streams across monitors, revealing the unmistakable signatures of human construction far below. Beside her stands Bob Ballard, the legendary oceanographer who discovered the Titanic, a man who needs no introduction to the art of finding things that were meant to stay lost. Together, they're looking at something that ancient sources never mentioned, something that earthquakes and tsunamis buried and forgot, something that might finally answer the question that has haunted historians for over 2,000 years. Where did they bury Cleopatra? The port lies approximately 30 miles west of Alexandria, directly offshore from a crumbling temple complex called Taposiris Magna. The name means Great Tomb of Osiris, and that alone should tell you something about what the ancient Egyptians thought this place represented. Osiris, the god of death and resurrection, the lord of the underworld, the divine judge who weighed souls in the afterlife. If you wanted to be buried somewhere that proclaimed your intentions to achieve immortality, to transcend death itself, to become one with the gods, this would be the place. And Cleopatra very much wanted all of those things. The discovery of this underwater port represents far more than just another archaeological site on Egypt's extensively studied coastline. Every ancient harbour tells a story about trade routes, about maritime technology, about the economic networks that sustained civilizations. But this one tells a different kind of story. This harbour wasn't mentioned in any ancient text. No Greek geographer mapped it. No Roman historian recorded its existence. It was hidden, forgotten, deliberately obscured by the accidents of geology and the passage of centuries, until now. The structures that Martinez and Ballard's team have found beneath the waves speak of sophisticated engineering. These aren't crude stone pilings or simple dock facilities. The polished floors suggest important ceremonial functions. The arrangement of columns indicates deliberate architectural planning. The amphorae date the exact period when Cleopatra ruled Egypt, when she was making her desperate final stand against the rising power of Rome, when she was preparing for an end that she knew was coming but refused to face as a captive. Understanding why this discovery matters requires understanding who Cleopatra was, beyond the Hollywood portrayals and the Roman propaganda that has shaped her image for 2 millennia. It requires diving deep into the world of Ptolemaic Egypt, a civilization that stood at the crossroads of African, Mediterranean, and Asian cultures, a kingdom that represented the last flowering of Hellenistic civilization before Rome absorbed it all. It requires following the extraordinary journey of an archaeologist who refused to accept conventional wisdom, who bet her entire career on a theory that most experts rejected. And it requires recognizing that sometimes the most important discoveries come from the most unlikely sources, from people who see patterns that everyone else has missed, from moments when obsession transforms into breakthrough. This is that story, the story of a lost queen, a forgotten port, and the woman who might finally be closing in on the greatest archaeological prize that remains to be found. This is the story of Cleopatra's lost world, and how it's finally being revealed. She was born in 69 BCE into a dynasty that was already dying. The Ptolemies had ruled Egypt for nearly 250 years by the time Cleopatra VII came into the world, but their power had been steadily eroding, their territories shrinking, their authority becoming increasingly dependent on Roman support. The glory days of the early Ptolemies, when Alexandria rivaled Athens as the intellectual centre of the world, when Egypt's wealth could tilt the balance of Mediterranean politics, when pharaohs commanded fleets and armies that could challenge any power on earth, those days were fading into memory. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XIII, or Letes, earned his nickname the Flute Player, partly because he actually played the instrument, but mostly as mockery. He was seen as weak, as more interested in music and entertainment than in governance, as willing to pay massive bribes to Rome just to keep his throne. He'd been driven from power once, forced to flee to Rome to beg for support, and only regained his throne through Roman military intervention. The Egypt he ruled was a shadow of its former self, territorially reduced, economically strained, politically unstable. Into this troubled realm came Cleopatra, third daughter of Ptolemy XIII, named after her mother, whose identity remains uncertain to this day. Some scholars suggest her mother might have been one of the king's concubines. Others propose she could have been his sister, Cleopatra V Tryphena. This uncertainty about her maternal lineage has fed endless speculation about Cleopatra's ethnicity and appearance, debates that often reveal more about modern preoccupations than ancient realities. What we know with certainty is that from a young age Cleopatra displayed an extraordinary intellect. While her royal predecessors had ruled Egypt for generations without bothering to learn the Egyptian language, seeing themselves as Greek overlords of a subject population, Cleopatra made herself fluent not just in Egyptian, but in multiple languages. Ancient sources credit her with speaking at least 9 languages, including Arabic, Hebrew, Aramaic, Ethiopian, Median, Parthian and Latin, in addition to her native Greek. This linguistic ability wasn't mere showmanship. It represented a fundamental understanding that power in the ancient world came not just from military force or inherited authority, but from the ability to communicate, to negotiate, to understand the perspectives and motivations of different peoples. While Roman senators viewed non-Romans as barbarians, while her own ancestors had maintained Greek as the exclusive language of the court, Cleopatra positioned herself as a bridge between cultures, as someone who could move fluently between Egyptian, Greek and Roman worlds. The ancient writers also praised her voice, comparing it to a multi-stringed musical instrument, describing it as melodious and captivating. Combined with her linguistic abilities, this suggests someone who understood the performative aspects of power, who knew that how you spoke was often as important as what you said. Later Roman historians would turn this into accusations of seduction and manipulation, but a more careful reading suggests a ruler who grasped the importance of rhetoric, of presentation, of crafting the image she wanted to project. When Ptolemy XIV died in 51 BCE, he left his kingdom to Cleopatra and her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, following the Egyptian tradition that required female rulers to have a male co-regent. Cleopatra was 18 years old. Her brother was only 12. In theory, they were supposed to rule jointly. In practice, Cleopatra immediately began positioning herself as the dominant partner, dropping Ptolemy XIII's name from official documents within months, depicting herself alone on coins and temple reliefs. This didn't sit well with Ptolemy XIII's advisors, a group of powerful courtiers who had no intention of seeing their influence diminish. Within a few years, civil war broke out. Cleopatra was forced to flee Egypt entirely, retreating to Syria to gather an army. She might have ended up as just another failed claimant to a disputed throne, another footnote in the complicated succession politics of the late Ptolemaic period, except that history intervened in the form of Julius Caesar. Caesar arrived in Egypt in 48 BCE while pursuing his rival Pompey the Great, who had fled there after his defeat at the Battle of Pharsalus. Pompey thought he could find sanctuary in Egypt. Instead, Ptolemy Tethys's advisors, hoping to curry favour with Caesar, had Pompey murdered and presented his severed head as a gift. They badly miscalculated Caesar's character. Rather than being pleased, Caesar was reportedly disgusted by this dishonourable treatment of a fellow Roman who had once been his son-in-law. Cleopatra saw her opportunity. According to legend, she had herself smuggled into Caesar's presence rolled up in a carpet, or, more likely based on the Greek wording, in a large sack or bedroll. This famous scene has been romanticised and sexualised by countless retellings, but the reality was probably more calculated than romantic. Cleopatra needed to meet Caesar without her brother's advisors interfering. She needed to make her case directly, to convince him that supporting her rather than Ptolemy the served Roman interests. It worked. Caesar threw his support behind Cleopatra, leading to the Alexandrian War, which ended with Ptolemy the Themed dead, drowned in the Nile during a battle, and Cleopatra restored to power. But now she ruled alongside Caesar, or rather, she ruled because Caesar allowed it. Egypt's independence, already compromised under her father, became even more theoretical. The price of Cleopatra's throne was accepting that Egypt now existed under Rome's shadow. Yet Cleopatra made the most of the situation. She and Caesar became lovers, and in 47 BCE she gave birth to a son she named Caesarion, Little Caesar. Whether Caesar was actually the father remains a matter of historical debate. Caesar himself never publicly acknowledged the child, which meant nothing legally in terms of inheritance or legitimacy. But Cleopatra made sure everyone in Egypt knew that her son was supposedly Caesar's child, strengthening her own position and creating a potential future claim to Roman power. When Caesar returned to Rome, Cleopatra followed him there, residing in one of Caesar's estates across the Tiber. This was an extraordinary breach of protocol. Foreign monarchs didn't simply take up residence in Rome, but Cleopatra wasn't just any foreign monarch. She represented Egypt's vast wealth, the grain supplies that fed Rome's population, access to luxury goods from the east. And Caesar, now dictator of Rome, could afford to ignore protocol when it served his purposes. During her time in Rome, Caesar erected a golden statue of Cleopatra as Venus in the Temple of Venus Genetrix. This association of Cleopatra with the goddess of love would shape how later generations perceived her, but at the time it was a powerful political statement. Venus was the divine ancestress of the Julian family. By linking Cleopatra to Venus, Caesar was making a claim about divine favour, about the legitimacy of their relationship, perhaps even about future dynastic plans. But those plans, whatever they might have been, died with Caesar on the Ides of March, 44 BCE, when a group of senators led by Brutus and Cassius assassinated him in the Senate chamber. Cleopatra remained in Rome for a brief time after Caesar's death, hoping perhaps that Caesarion might be recognised as Caesar's heir. But that position went to Caesar's grandnephew Octavian, named in Caesar's will as his adopted son. Cleopatra returned to Egypt, where she promptly had her younger brother and co-ruler Ptolemy Thorothoonth poisoned, replacing him with her son Caesarion as co-regent. The next decade would see Rome convulsed by civil war as Caesar's assassins battled his supporters, and then as those supporters turned on each other. Out of this chaos emerged a second triumvirate, 3 men who divided the Roman world between them: Octavian, controlling the west; Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, assigned Africa; and Mark Antony, taking control of the east. Mark Antony summoned Cleopatra to meet him in Tarsus in 41 BCE. Officially, he wanted to discuss Egypt's support for the triumvirate, to ensure that Egypt's grain and treasure would flow to his faction. But there were also questions about Cleopatra's loyalties during the recent conflicts. suggestions that she might have supported Brutus and Cassius against Caesar's avengers. Cleopatra understood the summons as both threat and opportunity. She arrived in Tarsus not as a supplicant but as a sovereign, sailing up the river Cydnus in a barge with gilded stern and purple sails, dressed as the goddess Isis, surrounded by attendants dressed as nymphs and graces, with incense burning and music playing. The ancient sources describe this scene in elaborate detail, emphasizing the theatrical spectacle, the overwhelming sensory experience designed to impress and seduce, and it worked. Antony and Cleopatra became lovers almost immediately, beginning a relationship that would last 11 years, produce 3 children, and ultimately lead to both their deaths. But characterizing their relationship as simply romantic misses the political calculation on both sides. Antony needed Egypt's wealth to fund his military campaigns, particularly his planned invasion of Parthia. Cleopatra needed Roman military support to maintain her throne, and, more ambitiously, to restore some of Egypt's lost territories. Their relationship was interrupted for 3 years when Antony returned to Italy and married Octavian's sister Octavia, part of a temporary reconciliation between the two triumvirs. But by 37 BCE, Antony was back in the east, had reunited with Cleopatra, and was openly treating her as his primary partner rather than his legitimate Roman wife. In 34 BCE, he held a ceremony in Alexandria known as the Donations of Alexandria, in which he and Cleopatra were proclaimed rulers of a vast eastern empire, and their children were designated as rulers of various territories. To Romans, this looked like treason. Antony was giving away Roman territories to an Egyptian queen and her half-Roman children. He was elevating a foreign monarch to equal status with Roman authority. He was, in their eyes, choosing Egypt over Rome, choosing Cleopatra over his duty to the Republic. Octavian, ever the shrewd politician, seized on this sentiment. He didn't declare war on Antony directly, knowing that would look like civil war. Instead, he declared war on Cleopatra, characterizing her as a foreign threat to Rome, painting Antony as her victim, seduced and enslaved by Eastern luxury and sexual excess. The propaganda was remarkably effective, and much of it has persisted in shaping Cleopatra's image ever since. The final confrontation came at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, a naval engagement off the coast of Greece. The battle was a disaster for Antony and Cleopatra's forces. Ancient sources claim Cleopatra fled mid-battle, and Antony, seeing her ships departing, abandoned his own fleet to follow her. Modern historians debate whether this was actually a planned retreat or a catastrophic failure of nerve. Either way, the result was the same. Octavian controlled the seas, controlled access to Egypt, and could now invade at his leisure. The invasion came in 30 BCE. Octavian's forces swept into Egypt, and resistance crumbled rapidly. Antony's remaining troops and naval forces defected to Octavian. Cornered in Alexandria, facing certain defeat and capture, Antony received a false report that Cleopatra had already killed herself. He fell on his sword, but the wound didn't kill him immediately. When he learned Cleopatra was actually still alive, he asked to be carried to her, and died in her arms. Cleopatra now faced the choice that every ruler in her position dreaded: surrender and face public humiliation in Rome, or die on her own terms. She attempted to negotiate with Octavian, perhaps hoping she could do with him what she'd done with Caesar and Antony, could find some way to preserve at least a remnant of Egyptian independence. But Octavian, unlike his predecessors, had no interest in partnerships or compromises. He wanted Egypt's wealth, not Egypt's queen. The exact circumstances of Cleopatra's death remain unclear. The most famous account claims she had an asp, an Egyptian cobra, brought to her concealed in a basket of figs, and that she allowed it to bite her. This story has powerful symbolic resonance in Egyptian religion. The cobra was the sacred protector of pharaohs, the uraeus that decorated their crowns. To die by a cobra's bite was to be received into the company of the gods. but other ancient sources suggest she might have poisoned herself with a toxic ointment, or by some other means. The presence of her hairdresser and servants during her final moments, which Roman sources mockingly presented as vanity, actually represents something far more significant in Egyptian royal custom. Court officials were responsible for the proper ritual disposal of a monarch's hair and nail clippings, preventing these items from falling into hostile hands where they might be used for magical purposes. Having these attendants present for her death ensured proper royal protocol even in her final moments. What we know for certain is that on August 12th, 30th BCE, at the age of 39, Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of the Ptolemaic dynasty and the last independent ruler of ancient Egypt, died. Octavian allowed her to be buried alongside Antony, honouring at least that final wish. But where they were buried, that information vanished from history, and with Cleopatra's death, Egypt ceased to be an independent kingdom and became a province of Rome. Octavian would soon become Augustus, the first Roman emperor, and the vast wealth he seized from Egypt would fund his transformation of Rome from republic to empire. Cleopatra's son Caesarion, theoretically now Ptolemy XV, and the rightful ruler of Egypt, was hunted down and killed. Octavian couldn't risk leaving alive any potential rival who might claim to be Caesar's true son. The 3 children Cleopatra had with Antony were spared and taken to Rome, where they were raised by Antony's widow Octavia, of all people. Cleopatra Selene, the daughter, eventually married Juba II of Mauritania and became queen of that North African kingdom. The 2 sons, Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus, disappear from historical records after childhood, their fates unknown. And so ended the Ptolemaic dynasty, 300 years of Greek rule over Egypt, and the last great independent power of the Hellenistic world. Everything after this would be Roman, then Byzantine, then Islamic. The Egypt that Cleopatra knew, that unique synthesis of ancient Egyptian, Greek and Mediterranean cultures, that cosmopolitan world centered on Alexandria, would gradually fade away. But the question of where they buried her body, of where the last pharaoh's tomb might lie, that question has haunted archaeologists and historians ever since. Because finding Cleopatra's tomb wouldn't just be about locating bones and grave goods, it would be about recovering a lost link to a vanished world, about understanding how this remarkable woman wanted to be remembered, about reading whatever messages she might have left for posterity. And it would be, without question, one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in history. To understand why Cleopatra's tomb matters so profoundly, you need to understand the world she ruled, the civilization that reached its zenith and died with her. The Ptolemaic dynasty represented something unique in ancient history, a bridge between cultures, a synthesis of traditions that had never quite happened before and would never happen again in quite the same way. When Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 332 BCE, liberating it from Persian rule, he wasn't just adding another territory to his growing empire. He was connecting the ancient world of the Nile Valley, with its 3,000 years of continuous civilization, to the dynamic new Greek culture that was spreading across the Mediterranean. Alexander founded Alexandria on the coast of Egypt, positioning it to be a link between Africa, Europe, and Asia, and the city quickly became everything he'd hoped for and more. After Alexander's death in 323 BCE, his empire fractured among his generals. Ptolemy, one of Alexander's closest companions and most trusted military commanders, took Egypt as his portion. He declared himself pharaoh in 305 BCE, establishing a dynasty that would rule for 3 centuries. The early Ptolemies were sophisticated rulers who understood that maintaining power in Egypt required respecting local traditions while also promoting Greek culture and learning. They built temples to Egyptian gods using traditional architectural styles and iconography, but they also established Alexandria as a centre of Greek scholarship that would eventually surpass even Athens. The Great Library of Alexandria, founded under Ptolemy the Firm and expanded by his successors, attempted to collect all the world's knowledge in one place. At its height, it held hundreds of thousands of scrolls, works of literature, science, mathematics, medicine, philosophy, geography, everything that the ancient world knew or thought it knew. Scholars from across the known world came to study at the Museum, the research institute attached to the library. Euclid wrote his elements there, laying the foundations of geometry. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth with remarkable accuracy. Herophilos and Erasistratus conducted the first systematic studies of human anatomy. Aristarchus proposed that the earth orbited the sun 18 centuries before Copernicus. The Septuagint, the first Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, was created in Alexandria for the city's large Jewish community. The city itself was a marvel of urban planning, laid out in a grid pattern unusual for ancient cities, with wide streets designed to catch cooling Mediterranean breezes. 2 great harbours served its maritime commerce, separated by a causeway that connected to Pharos Island, where one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world rose over 400 feet into the air. The lighthouse of Alexandria, completed under Ptolemy II, guided ships to safe harbour for over 1,000 years before earthquakes finally brought it down. Alexandria's population was cosmopolitan in a way that few ancient cities could match. Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, Phoenicians, Syrians, merchants and scholars from across the known world all lived together in this Mediterranean metropolis. The city had distinct quarters for different ethnic groups, but also significant mixing and cultural exchange. Greek philosophical schools flourished alongside Egyptian temples. Jewish scholars debated scripture in Greek while Egyptian priests maintained rituals that stretched back millennia. But Alexandria, for all its glory, was just one piece of Ptolemaic Egypt. The dynasty also built and maintained temples throughout the Nile Valley, establishing their legitimacy by presenting themselves as proper pharaohs who honoured the ancient traditions. The temples at Edfu, Dendera, Kom Ombo, Philae, these magnificent structures that still stand today, were largely built or heavily renovated during the Ptolemaic period. And about 30 miles west of Alexandria, overlooking Lake Mariut and the Mediterranean coast, the Ptolemies established a temple complex dedicated to Osiris. They called it Taposiris Magna, the Great Tomb of Osiris, referencing the ancient Egyptian belief that Osiris, the god of death and resurrection, was buried at this location. This wasn't just any temple. Osiris occupied a central position in Egyptian religious thought. According to mythology, Osiris had once been a benevolent king of Egypt who taught humans agriculture and civilized behavior. His jealous brother Set murdered him, dismembered his body, and scattered the pieces across Egypt. Osiris's wife Isis, in one of the great love stories of Egyptian mythology, searched tirelessly for the pieces, reassembled her husband's body, and through powerful magic briefly brought him back to life long enough to conceive their son Horus. Osiris then became the ruler of the underworld, the judge who weighed souls against the feather of truth, determining who would achieve eternal life and who would be devoured by the demon Ammit. Every pharaoh upon death was believed to become one with Osiris. To be buried near a site associated with Osiris, particularly one called the Great Tomb of Osiris, carried profound religious significance. It wasn't just about having a fancy tomb, it was about positioning yourself for the afterlife, about making a claim to divine status, about ensuring your soul's journey through the underworld would be successful. Taposiris Magna sat on a limestone ridge that separated the Mediterranean from Lake Mariut, which in ancient times was a freshwater lake connected to the Nile's westernmost mouth. The location gave the temple complex strategic commercial importance. Trade goods from Libya could arrive at the lake, pass through the temple area where they would be subject to customs duties, and then continue on to Alexandria or into Egypt's interior. Similarly, Egyptian goods could be shipped across the lake for export. The temple itself was founded around 280–270 BCE by Ptolemy II Philadelphus, one of the dynasty's most successful and ambitious rulers. The complex featured a temple to Osiris and Isis, a tower that may have served as a lighthouse or navigation beacon, and extensive underground structures including tunnels and burial chambers. The exact layout and extent of the complex remain uncertain because much of it has been lost to time, damaged by earthquakes, looted for building materials, or simply buried under centuries of accumulated sand and debris. Ancient sources provide tantalizing hints about Taposiris Magna's importance, but frustratingly little detail. Plutarch mentions it in his writings but doesn't describe it at length. No complete ancient account of the temple's layout, function, or significance survives. For modern archaeologists, this is both challenge and opportunity. When ancient sources don't tell you what a site was, when no maps or descriptions survive, you have to let the archaeology speak for itself. And that's where things get interesting. Because as excavations at Taposiris Magna have progressed over the past 2 decades, evidence has emerged suggesting this site was far more important during Cleopatra's reign than anyone previously suspected. The question is why? Why would Cleopatra have focused attention and resources on a temple complex 30 miles outside her capital? What made Taposiris Magna significant to her specifically? One answer lies in Cleopatra's religious policies. Unlike her predecessors, who had generally maintained a distance from Egyptian religion while supporting it financially, Cleopatra actively associated herself with the goddess Isis. She dressed as Isis in religious ceremonies and public appearances. She encouraged the identification of herself as the living incarnation of the goddess. On coins and temple reliefs, she had herself depicted with the traditional attributes of Isis: the throne headdress, the sistrum rattle, the ankh symbol. This wasn't mere political calculation, though it certainly served political purposes. Cleopatra seems to have genuinely engaged with the Egyptian religion in ways her ancestors hadn't. She was the first Ptolemaic ruler to learn to speak and read Egyptian, to study Egyptian religious texts, to participate meaningfully in Egyptian ceremonial life. For a population that had lived under Greek rule for nearly 3 centuries, this attention to their traditional culture must have been remarkable. And if Cleopatra saw herself as Isis, if she encouraged that identification, then it makes perfect sense that she would pay special attention to temples associated with Isis and Osiris. The mythology of Isis searching for Osiris, finding his body, restoring him to life, it resonated with themes of resurrection and eternal life that would have particular meaning for someone contemplating her own mortality. Now consider Cleopatra's situation in her final years. By 31 BCE, after the Battle of Actium, she knew the end was coming. Roman forces were closing in. Defeat was inevitable. The question was only how it would happen and what would come after. Roman custom involved parading defeated enemy rulers through the streets of Rome in chains during triumph ceremonies, subjecting them to public humiliation before usually executing them. The thought of such treatment, of being reduced to a spectacle for Roman entertainment, must have been unbearable. But there was another option. If she couldn't prevent her own death, she could at least control its circumstances and meaning. She could die as a pharaoh, following Egyptian funerary customs, prepared for the afterlife according to traditional practices. And if she were buried at a site sacred to Osiris, in a temple associated with death and resurrection, in a location that proclaimed her divine status and her connection to Egypt's ancient traditions, then even in death she could make a statement about who she was and how she wanted to be remembered. This is why Taposiris Magna matters. Not because of romantic notions about hidden treasure or lost secrets, but because it represents a possible answer to a historical question. If you were Cleopatra, knowing death was imminent, knowing that Roman forces would search for your body to parade through Rome's streets, knowing that your only chance to control your legacy was to control your burial, where would you choose to be laid to rest? The conventional answer has always been Alexandria. Most Egyptologists assume Cleopatra was buried somewhere in Alexandria's royal quarter, probably in or near the Ptolemaic royal tomb complex. The problem is that large portions of ancient Alexandria now lie underwater, submerged by earthquakes and tsunamis, particularly a massive earthquake and tsunami in 365 CE that caused widespread destruction along Egypt's northern coast. If Cleopatra's tomb was in the royal quarter, it's probably now beneath 40 feet of Mediterranean water, buried under layers of collapsed buildings and sediment, and may be completely unrecoverable. But what if Cleopatra planned differently? What if she specifically chose a location outside Alexandria, away from where Roman forces would immediately look, in a temple complex dedicated to the god of death and resurrection? What if the very name of the place, the Great Tomb of Osiris, was a clue hiding in plain sight? This is the theory that Kathleen Martinez has spent 20 years trying to prove, and the discoveries of the past 2 years suggest she might actually be right. Kathleen Teresa Martinez Berry was not supposed to become one of the most talked about archaeologists in the world. She was not supposed to lead excavations in Egypt, to make discoveries that would be featured in major museums and National Geographic documentaries, to spend 2 decades pursuing a theory that the entire archaeological establishment told her was wrong. She was supposed to be a lawyer, and for a while she was a very successful one. Martinez was born in Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic in 1966, into a family that valued intellectual achievement above almost everything else. Her father, Fausto Martinez, was a professor and legal scholar who owned the largest private library in the Caribbean, a collection of over 50,000 books that filled their home. From a young age, Kathleen was expected to read, widely to engage with ideas, to participate in the intellectual debates that took place in their home during her father's weekly salons, gatherings of the Dominican Republic's leading thinkers who would debate philosophy, law, history, politics. Her father would bring her books each week, and she was required to discuss what she'd learned with him. This rigorous intellectual training had predictable results. She skipped several grades in school, graduated at the top of her class, was admitted to law school at 15, and graduated at 18. She built a successful practice as a criminal lawyer in Santo Domingo, becoming one of the Dominican Republic's most sought-after criminal defense attorneys. But she never stopped thinking about archaeology. As a child, reading in her father's library, she'd become fascinated by ancient Egypt. She'd told her parents she wanted to be an archaeologist, wanted to go to Egypt, wanted to make great discoveries. They gently discouraged her. The Dominican Republic had no archaeological tradition, no universities that offered degrees in Egyptology, no obvious path for someone from a Caribbean island to become involved in excavations on another continent. It was an impractical dream, they told her. Choose a realistic career. So she did. But the dream never quite died. The turning point came in 1990, during a sleepless night in Madrid where she was living temporarily while her husband studied cardiology. To occupy herself, she'd earned a master's degree in finance, but found herself restless, looking for something more challenging. Browsing her father's library during a visit home, she picked up Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra. Her father dismissed it. Cleopatra was just a political schemer, he said, not even deserving of historical attention, certainly not the subject of serious study. That response bothered Martinez. How did her father know? What were his sources? What evidence supported this dismissive assessment? She decided to find out for herself. Over the next several years, while maintaining her law practice and raising 2 children, Martinez conducted what amounted to a thorough investigation of Cleopatra's life and death, approaching it the way she would approach a complex criminal case. She gathered evidence, analysed conflicting accounts, looked for inconsistencies in the official narrative, tried to understand motivations and patterns of behaviour. What she found surprised her. The historical sources painted Cleopatra as weak, seductive, manipulative, driven by emotion rather than reason. But when Martinez looked at Cleopatra's actions, stripped of the Roman propaganda and centuries of embellishment, she saw something different. She saw a skilled political operator who'd maintained Egypt's independence and prosperity for 2 decades, under circumstances that would have crushed a lesser ruler. She saw someone who'd learned multiple languages, engaged with philosophy and science, implemented economic reforms, negotiated with Rome's most powerful men on terms approaching equality. And she saw something else, something that no other historian seemed to have noticed. Cleopatra considered herself the living embodiment of the goddess Isis. Mark Antony had associated himself with the god Dionysus, who the Egyptians identified with Osiris. The story of their relationship, of their deaths, mirrored the mythology of Isis and Osiris, the goddess who searched for her murdered husband, who restored him to life, who was buried with him. Martinez began to ask questions about Cleopatra's death that no one else seemed to be asking. Why did she use a cobra to kill herself? Why smuggle a snake in a basket of figs, which seems absurdly complicated when a simple vial of poison would have been easier and more reliable? Was this choice symbolic? The cobra was sacred to Isis, a form that the goddess could take. To die by cobra bite was to be received into the goddess's presence. And where would Cleopatra be buried? If she saw herself as Isis, if she wanted to be reunited with Antony as Osiris in death, wouldn't she choose a burial place sacred to these deities, a place associated with death and resurrection, a place whose very name proclaimed the great Tomb of Osiris? This led Martinez to Taposiris Magna. On maps and in archaeological literature, the site was described as a partially ruined temple complex west of Alexandria. Interesting but not particularly significant, not considered a priority for excavation. Most of the site was unexcavated, covered by centuries of accumulated sand. But Martinez looked at it and saw possibility. In 2002, she travelled to Egypt without support, without permission, without any official status. She went as a tourist, essentially, with nothing but her theory and her determination. The Egyptian immigration officials detained her for hours, confused by her Dominican passport, uncertain why someone from a country that didn't even have an embassy in Egypt would come to pursue archaeological research. Eventually she was released, and she managed to get a meeting with Zahi Hawass, then the powerful director of Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities. This was either audacity or desperation, probably both. Hawass was not known for patience with amateur theories, or outsiders who thought they knew better than trained Egyptologists. Martinez was an unknown lawyer from a tiny Caribbean nation with no archaeological credentials, claiming she knew where to find Cleopatra's tomb based on her own research. It should have been a disaster. Instead, Martinez presented her case like the skilled lawyer she was. She laid out her evidence, explained her reasoning, anticipated objections, demonstrated that she'd actually studied the sources and the archaeology in detail. She described the tunnel she believed must exist beneath the temple, the foundation plates she thought would confirm the site's dedication to Isis during Cleopatra's reign, the patterns of burial practices that would indicate royal interments. And somehow, against all odds, she convinced him. Hawass agreed to support her petition to excavate at Taposiris Magna. But he set a condition. Before she could conduct underwater excavations, she had to find proof on land that the site was important during Cleopatra's reign. Specifically, she had to find the foundation plates, inscribed tablets that were placed beneath major structures during construction, recording why and when and by whom the building was erected. Foundation plates are often tiny, easily missed, and can be anywhere under a structure. Archaeological teams since the 1800s, including missions sent by Napoleon, had searched Taposiris Magna for these plates and found nothing. The site covered a large area, most of it unexcavated, and the plates could be literally anywhere, buried under meters of sand and rubble. It was, essentially, an impossible task, which was probably the point. Hawass, while intrigued by Martinez's theory, may have been giving her an objective she couldn't possibly achieve, allowing him to say he'd given her a chance while knowing she'd fail. Martinez went back to the Dominican Republic and assembled funding and support. The Catholic University of Santo Domingo agreed to partner with her. She established ties with Egyptian researchers. She spent her own money financing the initial excavations, and in 2004 she began work at Taposiris Magna. For the first few years she found interesting artefacts, but nothing conclusive. Coins from the Ptolemaic period, pottery fragments, evidence of burial chambers that had been looted in antiquity. The kind of material that confirmed the site was important, but didn't prove her specific theory about Cleopatra. Then, after 2 years of excavation, her team found the foundation plates. The small inscribed tablets that previous excavations had failed to locate, that everyone had said weren't there or had been destroyed centuries ago. The plates were inscribed in both Greek and hieroglyphics, and they confirmed that the temple had been dedicated to Isis and Osiris, that it had been built during the early Ptolemaic period, and that it had been maintained and used throughout Cleopatra's reign. This changed everything. Martinez now had archaeological proof that Taposiris Magna wasn't just some minor religious site. It was a major temple complex dedicated to deities that Cleopatra personally associated herself with, and she now had permission to expand her excavations, including underwater surveys. Over the following years, Martinez's team made a series of remarkable discoveries. They found 6 burial chambers inside the temple complex itself, an unprecedented find. Egyptian practice generally didn't involve burials inside temples. Temples were for worship, tombs were separate structures. But here were burial chambers integrated into the temple architecture, suggesting these weren't ordinary burials. They found coins bearing Cleopatra's image, over 300 of them eventually. The coins showed Cleopatra's official portrait, the face she wanted the world to see, her profile struck in bronze and silver, distributed across her realm as symbols of royal authority. They found an alabaster bust that might represent Cleopatra, though this remains debated. They found statues, amulets, bronze figures of deities, limestone vessels for cosmetics and ritual purposes, oil lamps, ceramic pots and jars from the Ptolemaic period. They found mummies that had been wrapped with gold leaf, a practice reserved for individuals of extremely high status. The gold leaf had mostly been looted in antiquity, but traces remained, and the mummies themselves showed evidence of careful preparation and expensive burial practices. And in 2022, they found the tunnel, a passageway carved through limestone, extending 4,300 feet, starting about 43 feet beneath the temple and heading toward the Mediterranean Sea. Ancient engineers had carved this tunnel with remarkable precision, giving it a geometry that experts described as miraculous. Part of the tunnel was submerged by seawater, flooded over the centuries as groundwater levels changed and the land gradually subsided. Inside the tunnel they found ceramic jars and pottery from Cleopatra's time. The tunnel itself dated to the late Ptolemaic period, and its alignment, its direction, suggested it connected the temple complex to something offshore, something that ought to be under the sea. That's when Martinez contacted Bob Ballard. If anyone could find what the tunnel was pointing to, if anyone had the expertise and technology to survey the seafloor and identify underwater structures, it was the man who'd found the Titanic. Ballard, now in his 80s but still actively involved in underwater exploration, was intrigued. This wasn't his usual type of project. His career had focused on deep-sea exploration, on shipwrecks in the abyssal depths, on pushing the boundaries of underwater technology. But the challenge of finding Cleopatra's tomb, of potentially making one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in history, that was hard to resist. He assembled a team of marine archaeologists and engineers. They brought sonar mapping equipment, remotely operated vehicles, diving equipment, all the technology that modern underwater archaeology could deploy. The Egyptian Navy provided support, offering ships and personnel to help with the survey. And they found it. The port, the harbour complex, the structures that shouldn't be there, that ancient sources never mentioned, that had been hidden beneath the waves for nearly 2,000 years. The data started coming in slowly at first, faint returns on the sonar, anomalies that could have been natural rock formations but showed patterns suggesting human construction. Bob Ballard's team methodically mapped the sea floor, building up a three-dimensional picture of what lay beneath the Mediterranean about a mile offshore from Taposiris Magna. What emerged from that data was unmistakable. Rows of stone structures, arranged in deliberate patterns, columns, some still standing, over 20 feet tall, floors of polished stone, the kind of careful construction that spoke of significant investment and skilled craftsmanship. And everywhere, scattered across the site, artifacts. Amphorae, the large ceramic jars used throughout the ancient Mediterranean to transport wine, oil, grain, all manner of goods. Anchors, both stone and metal, of various sizes suggesting different types of vessels. Ceramic fragments, bronze fittings, all the material detritus of a working port. The structures themselves were massive, buildings rising more than 6 meters from the seabed, constructed of large stone blocks held together with mortar and cement. These weren't simple dock facilities. This was major construction, the kind of architecture that required substantial resources and skilled engineers. One area, dubbed Salam 5 by the research team, contained several tall rectangular stone structures. Divers exploring the site found basalt pedestals that looked remarkably similar to the bases of broken statues at the Taposiris Magna temple itself, suggesting a direct architectural connection between the land site and the underwater structures. Nearby, another formation consisting of 3 stone pillars arranged in close proximity, which the team called the Three Sisters, showed the same kind of careful placement and construction. These weren't random rock falls or natural geological formations. Every aspect of the site indicated intentional design, specific purposes, conscious arrangement. The depth of the port, approximately 40 feet below the current sea level, tells us something about the geological changes that have occurred along Egypt's northern coast over the past 2 millennia. The ancient coastline lay about 2.5 miles inland from where it is today. What's now underwater was once dry land, or at least shallow water protected by reefs and barriers, suitable for harbour construction. Multiple earthquakes struck this region between 320 CE and 1303 CE, devastating Alexandria and the surrounding coastal areas. The worst was the massive earthquake and tsunami of 365 CE, which caused huge sections of Alexandria's royal quarter to collapse into the sea and triggered widespread destruction along the entire Egyptian coast. Each subsequent earthquake would have caused further subsidence, gradually lowering the land relative to sea level, until eventually the port at Taposiris Magna slipped entirely beneath the waves. The ceramics found at the underwater site provide crucial dating evidence. Archaeologists can identify pottery types and styles with remarkable precision, using them as chronological markers. The amphorae and other vessels at this port date to the late Ptolemaic period, specifically to the time when Cleopatra ruled Egypt. This wasn't a harbour from earlier centuries that happened to be near Taposiris Magna. This was a functioning port during Cleopatra's reign, part of the infrastructure that supported the temple complex and the surrounding region. The discovery resolves a long-standing puzzle about Taposiris Magna's function and importance. Historical sources indicated the site had economic significance as a customs station for trade between Libya and Egypt, but the scale of construction at the temple seemed to exceed what would be needed for a simple toll collection point. Now we understand why. Taposiris Magna wasn't just a temple with a minor trading post attached. It was a major maritime facility, a harbour complex that could accommodate significant shipping traffic, a hub where goods from across the Mediterranean and Libya could be received, processed, taxed, and redistributed. This commercial importance doesn't diminish the site's religious significance. Rather, it enhances it. Throughout the ancient world, temples often functioned as economic centres as well as places of worship. Temple treasuries held wealth. Temple workshops produced goods. Temple lands generated agricultural income. The priests who administered temples were often the most educated and literate members of society, capable of keeping complex records, managing large-scale operations, serving as judges and officials. A temple complex like Taposiris Magna, with its own dedicated port, its strategic location between Alexandria and Libya, its religious significance as a site sacred to Osiris, would have been both spiritually important and economically valuable. This dual role made it worth the substantial investment required to build and maintain the facility. But the discovery's real significance lies in its connection to the tunnel that Martinez's team found in 2022. That tunnel extends from beneath the temple, carved through limestone heading in a specific direction, and now we know where it was heading. The tunnel pointed directly at the harbour. The two structures, separated by nearly a mile, were connected by design, part of an integrated complex that linked the temple to the sea. Why would you need a tunnel connecting a temple to a port? There are several possible explanations, not mutually exclusive. The tunnel could have served as a water management system, channeling groundwater or allowing controlled flooding of certain areas. It could have been a processional route, allowing priests or important visitors to move between the temple and harbour without exposure to public view. It could have had defensive purposes, providing an escape route or hidden access in case of attack, or it could have been built specifically to facilitate a secret burial. If you wanted to move a body from the temple to a tomb located at or near the harbour, if you wanted to do so away from prying eyes, if you wanted to ensure that no one except your most trusted followers knew where the burial actually took place, a tunnel would be ideal. Martinez believes this is exactly what happened. Her theory, which she's been building evidence for over 20 years, suggests that when Cleopatra died, her body was prepared according to Egyptian custom, at a location in Alexandria. But rather than being buried in the city, where Roman forces would have immediate access, her body was transported secretly to Taposiris Magna. From there, it was moved through the tunnel to the harbour, placed on a boat, and taken to a final resting place, possibly on an island or in a sea cave, somewhere that would be protected both physically and spiritually. This theory explains several puzzling aspects of the historical record. Ancient sources confirm that Octavian allowed Cleopatra to be buried with Antony, honouring at least that final request. But those sources don't specify where the burial took place, which seems odd if it happened in Alexandria, where Roman forces had complete control. This silence in the sources makes more sense if the burial occurred at a location outside the city, in a place that the Romans either didn't know about or couldn't easily access. The association with Isis and Osiris reinforces this interpretation. In Egyptian mythology, Isis searched desperately for Osiris's body after Set had murdered and dismembered him. She found the pieces scattered across Egypt, reassembled them, and through powerful magic briefly restored Osiris to life. The story emphasizes the importance of the body, of proper burial, of having all the pieces together. For Cleopatra, who identified herself with Isis, ensuring that her body and Antony's were buried together in a place sacred to these deities would have been paramount. The timing also fits. The port was actively being used during Cleopatra's reign, as evidenced by the ceramics. The tunnel was carved during the late Ptolemaic period. The foundation plates confirm the temple was maintained and important during her rule. She knew for years that her reign might end badly, that Rome was growing more powerful, that her position was increasingly precarious. She would have had time to plan, to prepare, to make arrangements for her burial. The recent discoveries have added substantial weight to Martinez's theory. Though debate continues among Egyptologists, many still maintain that Cleopatra was buried in Alexandria, pointing out that moving a body 30 miles along the coast, even secretly, would have been difficult and risky. They note that no ancient source mentions Taposiris Magna in connection with Cleopatra's burial. They argue that the tunnel could have had other purposes, that the port's existence doesn't prove anything about royal tombs, but the evidence keeps accumulating. In December 2024 and January 2025, Martinez's team announced additional discoveries that have intensified interest in the site. Beneath the southern wall of the temple's outer enclosure, they found foundation deposits containing ritual, objects and funerary items from the late Ptolemaic period. These included miniature pottery jars, oil lamps, marble and quartzite fragments, bronze figurines, iron tools, beads, glass vessels, and a scarab amulet inscribed with the text, "The justice of Ra has arisen." They also found a white marble bust of a woman wearing a royal crown. Martinez believes this depicts Cleopatra, though other archaeologists dispute this identification, noting that the facial features differ from known representations on coins and other portraits. The debate highlights a fundamental challenge in identifying ancient portraits. Ancient art wasn't trying to be photographic. Artists followed conventions, emphasized certain features for symbolic reasons, idealized or modified appearances based on cultural expectations. Additionally, a limestone bust of a king wearing the Nemes headdress, the distinctive striped headcloth associated with pharaohs, was discovered. The identity of this king remains uncertain, but the craftsmanship and materials suggest high status. Perhaps most significantly, the team found 337 coins, many bearing Cleopatra's image. This represents a substantial hoard, far more than you'd expect from ordinary commercial activity. Coins were often included in foundation deposits or buried as part of ritual practices, and this collection provides concrete evidence of Cleopatra's presence at the site. Underwater excavations have revealed even more. Human remains have been found in the submerged areas around the port, along with vast quantities of pottery. The remains are currently being analysed to determine whether they represent accidental drownings, shipwreck victims, or deliberate burials. The sheer quantity of material suggests sustained activity at this location over an extended period. The site also revealed evidence of sophisticated engineering. The harbour was protected by natural reefs that created barriers against strong Mediterranean currents and storms. The ancient builders had worked with these natural features, positioning their constructed elements to maximise protection and utility. The polished floors found underwater suggest areas designed for ceremonial purposes or high-status activities, not merely utilitarian loading docks. All of this comes together to paint a picture of Taposiris Magna as far more important in the late Ptolemaic period than historians had recognised. This wasn't a backwater temple, it was a major religious and commercial centre, actively maintained during Cleopatra's reign, connected to the sea by sophisticated infrastructure, and associated with deities that Cleopatra personally revered. The question now is what lies undiscovered. The port complex covers a large area, and only portions have been surveyed. The tunnel extends 4,300 feet and is partially submerged. Following it to its endpoint will require extensive underwater archaeology. The temple itself still has areas that remain unexcavated. Ground-penetrating radar has suggested additional underground structures that haven't been explored. Martinez and her team are planning new excavations focused on Salam 5 and other promising areas of the underwater site. They're also continuing to work on the tunnel, attempting to map its full extent and explore the flooded sections. The Egyptian Navy and the Supreme Council of Antiquities are providing support for this ongoing research. The National Geographic documentary Cleopatra's Final Secret, which premiered in September 2024, captured some of this recent work and helped bring international attention to the discoveries. The film showed the dramatic moment when divers first explored the underwater structures, the painstaking process of mapping and cataloguing artifacts, the collaboration between archaeologists, engineers, and Egyptian officials. But perhaps the most compelling moment in the documentary comes when Martinez, standing at the entrance to the tunnel, speaks about what drives her. "People say I'm obsessed," she acknowledges. "Maybe I am, but when you're searching for one of the greatest mysteries in history, when you're this close, when every discovery leads to new questions and new possibilities, how can you not be obsessed? This isn't just about finding a tomb, it's about recovering a lost world, understanding how Cleopatra wanted to be remembered, giving voice to someone who's been silenced by centuries of propaganda and myth. That sentiment captures something essential about archaeology at its best. It's not treasure hunting. It's not about looting the past for valuable objects. It's about recovering knowledge, about understanding how people lived and died, about connecting across millennia to comprehend human experiences different from our own, yet fundamentally recognizable. Every artifact recovered from Taposiris Magna and its underwater port adds a piece to our understanding of Ptolemaic Egypt in its final decades. The coins, for instance, tell us about economic conditions and royal propaganda. The fact that over 300 coins bearing Cleopatra's image have been found at this single site suggests several things. First, that the site was economically active and important during her reign. Second, that Cleopatra was minting coins at substantial levels, which indicates confidence in the stability of her currency and government, at least until the final years. Third, that her portrait was being deliberately circulated, reinforcing her image and authority throughout her realm. The portraits on these coins show us what Cleopatra wanted people to see. Ancient coins served as mass media in an age before printing or photography. The image on a coin reached thousands or millions of people, establishing in their minds what the ruler looked like, how they wanted to be perceived. Cleopatra's coin portraits show a woman with a strong profile, prominent nose, firm chin, and distinctive features. This wasn't Hollywood, glamour, or classical Greek idealized beauty. This was power, authority, intelligence made visible. Some scholars have used these coin portraits to argue that Cleopatra wasn't conventionally attractive, missing the point entirely. Physical appearance by modern Western standards is irrelevant to understanding Cleopatra's appeal and effectiveness. Her contemporaries praised not her physical beauty, but her voice, her presence, her wit, her ability to speak multiple languages fluently, her intelligence and force of personality. The ancient writer Plutarch noted that her actual beauty was not supremely remarkable, but that her conversation and personal qualities created an irresistible charm. The gold leaf found on mummies at Taposiris Magna reveals something about burial practices for the elite during this period. Gold leaf was expensive. Covering a mummy with it represented a substantial investment, reserved for individuals of the higher status. Most of this gold was looted in antiquity, peeled away by tomb robbers who recycled it or sold it. But traces remain, and their presence confirms that people of extreme importance were buried at this site. Some of these mummies had golden tongues, literal pieces of gold shaped like tongues, and placed in the deceased's mouth. This practice relates to beliefs about the afterlife. The deceased needed to be able to speak, to answer questions posed by deities, to recite spells and formulas that would ensure safe passage. A golden tongue ensured the ability to speak in the presence of the gods, made the deceased worthy of divine conversation. The scarab amulet inscribed with "The justice of Ra has arisen" carries multiple layers of meaning. Ra was the sun god, the supreme deity in many periods of Egyptian history. Justice, or mayat, was a fundamental concept in Egyptian religion and philosophy, representing truth, order, balance, the proper way things should be. The phrase suggests both religious devotion and political legitimacy. A ruler who claimed that the justice of Ra had arisen was claiming divine approval, asserting that their reign represented the restoration of proper order. The architectural sophistication visible in both the land structures and the underwater port demonstrates the technical capabilities that the late Ptolemaic period could still muster, despite political and military pressures. The precision of the tunnel construction, which experts have compared to the famous tunnel of Eupalinos on the Greek island of Samos, shows that Egyptian engineers working under Ptolemaic administration retained the knowledge and skills to execute complex projects. The polished floors found underwater suggest spaces designed for visibility, for presentation, for ceremonies where appearance mattered. You don't polish stone unless you intend people to see it, to walk on it, to recognise the labour and expense invested in creating such surfaces. These floors might have been part of religious processions, important commercial ceremonies, or royal visits. Their existence implies that the harbour wasn't just functional, it was symbolic, a statement about power and permanence. The range of pottery types and their origins tell us about Taposiris Magna's connections to the broader Mediterranean world. Amphorae from different regions indicate trade networks extending from Libya, Greece, the Levant, possibly even Spain, and North Africa's Atlantic coast. Egypt exported grain and papyrus, imported wine and olive oil, participated in complex exchange networks that linked dozens of different cultures and economies. The harbour at Taposiris would have been one node in these networks, a place where ships from different regions could dock, unload, reload, conduct business. The presence of multiple anchors of different sizes and styles indicates various types of vessels using the port. Large merchant ships would have required substantial anchors, military vessels something different, fishing boats or coastal traders still other designs. The variety suggests a busy, diverse maritime community, not a sleepy backwater, but an active centre of commercial and perhaps military naval activity. The bronze figurines of deities found in the foundation deposits reflect the religious syncretism characteristic of Ptolemaic Egypt. Greek and Egyptian religious practices had been interacting for 3 centuries by Cleopatra's time, producing hybrid forms, shared festivals, identifications between different deities. Isis was identified with Aphrodite and Demeter, Osiris with Dionysus and Hades, Serapis, a god essentially invented by the early Ptolemies, combined aspects of Egyptian and Greek deities into something new that both cultures could worship. This religious flexibility, this willingness to see parallels and connections between different traditions, was one of the Ptolemaic dynasty's strengths. It allowed Greek rulers to maintain legitimacy in Egyptian eyes, while also preserving their Hellenic identity. It created space for cultural exchange, for genuine synthesis rather than simple domination. The oil lamps, ceramic vessels, and other mundane objects found at the site tell us about daily life, about the practical aspects of maintaining a large temple complex. Lamps provided light in interior spaces, in tunnels and chambers and nighttime ceremonies. Storage vessels held oil, wine, water, grain, all the provisions needed for a functioning community of priests, workers, administrators. These aren't dramatic finds, but they're essential for understanding how the site actually operated, how people lived and worked here day to day. The fact that excavations have revealed at least 20 tombs in the necropolis near the temple, including catacombs and underground burial chambers, indicates that Taposiris Magna served as a burial site for a significant population over an extended period. Many of these graves contain Greco-Roman style mummies, buried with their faces turned toward the temple. This orientation isn't accidental. It suggests that the deceased or their families believed the temple contained something or someone of supreme importance, someone whose spiritual power would benefit those buried facing that direction. This pattern of burials facing the temple appears at other Egyptian sites associated with royal or divine burials. The obvious parallel is the Valley of the Kings near Thebes, where nobles and officials often arranged to be buried as close as possible to the royal tombs, seeking proximity to pharaonic power even in death. All of these details, these fragments of evidence accumulated over 20 years of excavation, build toward a comprehensive picture of Taposiris Magna as a site of exceptional importance during Cleopatra's reign. The conventional view of Taposiris as a minor provincial temple, interesting but peripheral to the main story of Ptolemaic Egypt, can no longer be sustained. The evidence demands a reassessment. This doesn't automatically prove that Cleopatra is buried there. Archaeological evidence rarely provides that kind of definitive proof outside of finding an actual body with identifying inscriptions. But it does establish that Martinez's theory is plausible, that Taposiris Magna had the right characteristics, the right connections, the right symbolic resonance to serve as Cleopatra's chosen burial place. The scholarly debate will continue. Some Egyptologists remain skeptical, arguing that the evidence, while impressive, still doesn't definitively place Cleopatra at this site. They note that important temples often received royal attention without being royal burial places. They point out that the absence of any ancient source mentioning Taposiris in connection with Cleopatra's burial is significant. They suggest that Martinez's interpretation, while creative, goes beyond what the evidence strictly demonstrates. Other scholars are more sympathetic to Martinez's arguments. They note that the combination of factors here, the religious significance, the deliberate concealment, the timing of construction, the wealth invested in the site, the tunnel, the port, the pattern of burials, all of this creates a circumstantial case that, while not proven, is compelling enough to warrant serious consideration and further investigation. What everyone agrees on is that the recent discoveries have elevated Taposiris Magna from a secondary archaeological site to one of primary importance. Even if Cleopatra's tomb is never found here, even if Martinez's specific theory proves wrong, the work being done at this site is recovering crucial information about late Ptolemaic Egypt, about maritime infrastructure, about religious practices, about the final decades of Egypt's last pharaonic dynasty. And the possibility remains, tantalizingly present in every new discovery, that the next excavation season, the next underwater survey, the next tunnel exploration might finally reveal what everyone is searching for. As of early 2025, the excavations at Taposiris Magna are entering what might be their most critical phase. Martinez and her team, supported by the Egyptian government and collaborating with international experts, have plans for intensive work both on land and underwater over the coming months. The underwater investigations will focus on Salam 5 and the areas designated as the Three Sisters, conducting detailed mapping and selective excavation of the most promising structures. Bob Ballard's team has created comprehensive three-dimensional models of the underwater topography using photogrammetry and sonar data, giving archaeologists a detailed map to work from. These models allow researchers to study the site remotely, plan excavation strategies, identify areas most likely to yield important discoveries. The tunnel system beneath the temple represents perhaps the most tantalizing target for future exploration. Following the tunnel to its full extent, documenting its construction, understanding its purpose, and discovering where exactly it connects to the harbour, these objectives will require sophisticated equipment and careful methodology. Parts of the tunnel are flooded, requiring underwater archaeology techniques. Other sections might be unstable after 2,000 years, requiring shoring and safety measures. If the tunnel was indeed used to transport Cleopatra's body, there might be evidence along its route. Pottery fragments, wall inscriptions, construction features that indicate special use, traces of organic materials, anything that could confirm or refute Martinez's theory. Even if the tunnel reveals nothing directly related to Cleopatra, mapping its full extent will provide valuable information about Ptolemaic engineering capabilities. On land, the area around the temple complex still has extensive unexcavated zones. Ground-penetrating radar has identified subsurface anomalies, possible underground chambers or structures that haven't been explored. Some of these might be additional tombs, others could be storage facilities, administrative buildings, priests' quarters, any of the various structures needed for a functioning temple community. The question of the marble bust discovered in December 2024 remains unresolved. Is it Cleopatra? Facial recognition software has been applied to compare the bust with known portraits on coins and other sources, but the results are inconclusive. Different experts examine the same evidence and reach different conclusions. This ambiguity frustrates but also illustrates the challenges of ancient portraiture. We want definitive answers. History often gives us only probabilities and maybes. The broader scholarly response to Martinez's work has been mixed, which is typical for revolutionary theories in archaeology. Some Egyptologists have embraced her research, recognizing that her outsider perspective allowed her to see patterns that conventional wisdom had missed. They credit her with rehabilitating an important site that had been neglected, with applying fresh thinking to old questions, with pursuing a theory rigorously even when the establishment discouraged her. Others remain more cautious or critical. They appreciate the discoveries but question the interpretation. They worry that the search for Cleopatra's tomb has overshadowed other important aspects of the site, that the focus on one dramatic theory might be distorting research priorities. They note that tomb hunting, while exciting for the public, isn't always the most scientifically valuable archaeology. Zahi Hawass himself has offered qualified support mixed with skepticism. In interviews, he's praised Martinez's dedication and the significance of her discoveries, while also expressing doubt that Cleopatra is actually buried at Taposiris Magna. His comment that the Egyptians never buried inside a temple reflects traditional Egyptological understanding, though the discovery of burial chambers within the Taposiris temple structure complicates that generalization. Martinez has addressed these criticisms directly, arguing that extraordinary circumstances might have prompted extraordinary measures. If Cleopatra wanted to hide her burial place from Roman forces, if she wanted to ensure her body wouldn't be captured and displayed, if she wanted to make a religious statement about her identification with Isis, then burial in a temple dedicated to Isis, and Osiris might have been exactly the right choice, even if it violated normal practice. The public fascination with this search shows no signs of diminishing. The National Geographic documentary has been watched by millions. Martinez has become a media figure, interviewed by major publications, profiled in documentaries, invited to speak at conferences and universities worldwide. This attention brings both benefits and pressures. More publicity means more funding opportunities, more support for the excavations, more public awareness of archaeology's importance. But it also means heightened expectations, more scrutiny, more opportunities for criticism if the dramatic discovery doesn't materialize. Martinez herself seems remarkably focused despite the attention. In interviews, she consistently emphasizes the scientific value of the work regardless of whether Cleopatra's tomb is found. She points out that the team has discovered over 2,600 artifacts, documented extensive architectural remains, mapped a previously unknown port complex, changed our understanding of Taposiris Magna's importance. Even if the specific quest for Cleopatra's tomb ultimately proves unsuccessful, the research has already justified itself many times over. There's also the question of what would happen if the tomb is actually found. The discovery would be one of the most significant archaeological finds in history, comparable to Tutankhamun's tomb or the Terracotta Army. But it would also trigger complex questions about preservation, ownership, interpretation, and display. Would the tomb be left in place or excavated? Would the contents be distributed to museums or kept together? How would the Egyptian government balance tourism opportunities with conservation needs? And what would we actually find? Would the burial be intact or looted? Would there be inscriptions explaining Cleopatra's final thoughts, her instructions for the afterlife, her justifications for her choices? Would the artifacts illuminate the last days of Ptolemaic Egypt in ways that written sources never could? Or would time and circumstances have destroyed everything, leaving only a bare chamber with minimal evidence? These questions remain unanswered. But the search continues, season after season, survey after survey, each new discovery adding to our understanding whether or not it leads directly to the ultimate goal. The work requires patience, persistence, the ability to continue when progress is slow, when findings are ambiguous, when critics are vocal. Martinez embodies these qualities. She's now spent over 20 years on this project, investing her own money, building international collaborations, training young archaeologists from the Dominican Republic and Egypt, creating a research program that will continue regardless of her personal involvement. She's established the Dominican Republic's presence in Egyptology, demonstrating that important contributions can come from unexpected places, that the archaeological establishment doesn't have a monopoly on insight or discovery. Whether or not Cleopatra's tomb is found at Taposiris Magna, whether Martinez's specific theory proves correct or not, her work has already achieved something remarkable. She's forced a reassessment of an important site. She's demonstrated the value of fresh perspectives and unconventional approaches. She's shown that determination, careful research, and willingness to challenge consensus can lead to genuine breakthroughs. And she's reminded us why Cleopatra still matters, why this search resonates so powerfully. Cleopatra represents the end of an era, the last link to 3,000 years of pharaonic civilization, the final flowering of Hellenistic culture before Rome absorbed it all. Finding her tomb would be recovering that lost connection, hearing a voice that's been silent for 2 millennia, understanding how she wanted to be remembered. Every society gets the historical figures it needs. Each generation reinterprets the past through its own concerns and values. For centuries, Cleopatra was primarily seen through Roman propaganda, as a seductress who corrupted Roman men, as a symbol of Eastern decadence and moral decay. The Victorian era romanticised her love affairs while maintaining moral disapproval. The 20th century turned her into a glamorous Hollywood figure, all spectacle and costume, Elizabeth Taylor in elaborate makeup. Now, in the 21st century, we're recovering a different Cleopatra, a skilled political operator navigating impossible circumstances, a linguist and scholar who engaged seriously with multiple cultural traditions, a ruler who maintained Egypt's independence and prosperity for 2 decades, while stronger powers circled, a woman who understood both traditional Egyptian values and Hellenistic philosophy, who could negotiate with Roman generals as an equal, who made choices about power and legacy that deserved to be understood on their own terms, rather than filtered through hostile sources. Finding her tomb, if it can be found, would provide evidence for this revised understanding. It would show us how Cleopatra wanted to present herself for eternity, what messages she wanted to leave for posterity, what religious and cultural symbols she chose to surround herself with in death. It would be a rare case of recovering an historical figure's own voice, unmediated by the prejudices of those who wrote about them. That's what makes this search matter. Not treasure, not spectacle, not tourism revenue, though all of those might follow from a major discovery. What matters is knowledge, understanding, connection across vast stretches of time to comprehend lives lived long ago under circumstances dramatically different from our own, yet recognisably human. And so, the work continues. Divers explore ancient structures beneath the Mediterranean. Archaeologists carefully excavate deposits of artefacts. Engineers survey tunnels carved through limestone 2,000 years ago. Scholars debate interpretations, examine evidence, construct and critique theories. All of it in service of answering a question that has haunted historians since the day Cleopatra died. Where is she buried? What did she want us to know? What secrets lie hidden in Egypt's sands and beneath Egypt's waters, waiting for the right combination of persistence, technology and insight to bring them back to light? We don't know yet, but we're closer than we've ever been. And that possibility, that tantalising maybe tomorrow feeling that drives all archaeology at its best, keeps the search alive. Standing at Taposiris Magna today, you can see where the ancient temple complex once dominated the landscape, where processions of priests and pilgrims moved along sacred pathways, where Cleopatra herself might have walked. The site is partially ruined now, reduced by centuries of earthquakes and human activity, but traces remain. Column drums lie scattered. Foundation walls are still visible. The entrance to the great tunnel waits in darkness, holding whatever secrets it holds. And a mile offshore, beneath 40 feet of water, the lost harbour waits as well. Divers can swim among the ancient structures, can touch stones that workers cut and placed when Augustus was transforming Rome from republic to empire. When Jesus hadn't yet been born, when the world was young and strange and utterly different from our own. This is what archaeology gives us. Not just artefacts and ruins, but connections. Bridges across time. The opportunity to stand where others stood, to see what they built, to touch what they touched, and through that physical connection to imagine what they thought, hoped, feared, believed. For Kathleen Martinez, the search has become her life's work. What started as curiosity about a historical figure, nurtured during sleepless nights in Madrid, transformed into the defining project of her career. She left a successful law practice, moved to another continent, spent her own money funding excavations, faced skepticism and criticism, persisted through setbacks and disappointments, kept working even when conventional wisdom said she was wrong. That level of commitment requires more than just professional interest. It requires conviction that the questions matter, that recovering this knowledge is worth the sacrifice, that some mysteries deserve to be pursued even when success isn't guaranteed. Whether Martinez finds Cleopatra's tomb or not, whether her specific theory proves correct or requires revision, she's already succeeded in the most important ways. She's changed how we think about Taposiris Magna. She's demonstrated that important discoveries can come from unexpected sources. She's shown that persistence and careful research can overturn conventional wisdom, and she's kept alive the story of a remarkable historical figure who deserves to be understood in her full complexity. Cleopatra wasn't just a doomed romantic, wasn't just a political manipulator, wasn't just a victim of Roman propaganda. She was a ruler who maintained Egyptian independence against overwhelming odds, a scholar who mastered multiple languages and intellectual traditions, a strategist who negotiated with Rome's most powerful men on terms approaching equality, a woman who faced certain defeat and chose to control the circumstances of her death rather than accept humiliation. Finding her tomb would let her speak again, would show us her final statement, her chosen symbols, her preparations for eternity, would give us evidence about what mattered to her, what she wanted remembered, how she understood her own place in history. And until that day comes, if it ever does, the search continues. Each artifact recovered, each structure documented, each piece of the puzzle fitted into place brings us closer. The underwater port revealed, the tunnel mapped, the coins catalogued, the foundation deposits analysed, all of it building toward understanding, toward knowledge, toward connection with a lost world. This is the work that matters, not just for specialists, not just for academics, but for everyone who cares about human history, who wants to understand how we got here, who believes that recovering the past enriches the present. We are all descendants of everyone who came before. Their choices, their struggles, their achievements and failures shaped the world we inhabit. Knowing their stories, understanding their lives, that makes us more fully human. So if you found this exploration of Cleopatra's lost world fascinating, if the search for answers about one of history's most compelling figures resonates with you, if the idea of archaeologists working to recover knowledge that's been hidden for 2,000 years captures your imagination, then there's one thing you can do right now to support this kind of work. Give this video a like and subscribe to this channel. It tells the algorithm that you want to see more content about archaeology, about history, about the ongoing quest to understand our past. It helps ensure that these stories get told, that the work of researchers like Kathleen Martinez reaches a wide audience, that knowledge continues to spread. Because every great discovery starts with curiosity, with someone asking questions that others have stopped asking, with someone looking at familiar evidence and seeing new possibilities, with someone willing to pursue an idea even when conventional wisdom says it's wrong. That's how we find lost cities, decipher dead languages, recover vanished civilizations. That's how we understand who we are by understanding who came before. That's how archaeology transforms from dry academic pursuit into compelling human story. So stay curious, keep asking questions, and maybe, just maybe, the next update on this story will be the one we've all been waiting for. The announcement that after 2,000 years, after countless searches, after all the speculation and theory and debate, someone has finally found it. The tomb of Cleopatra, the last pharaoh's final secret. The lost world, revealed at last.